On Saturday night, the 4th of August, 2018, near Masyaf in Syria's Hama province, a car moved out of a residential margin and toward darker countryside. Reports later disagreed on the exact stretch of road. None published a block number, only the simple geography, Hama countryside, and a man whose work had drawn eyes from far beyond Syria. Months earlier, an April 2018 press photograph carried a clinical caption about wreckage at a scientific studies and research center site. Concrete, rebar, open rooms, where walls used to be. The picture didn't show hands. The record rarely does. In reconstruction, the last gesture is ordinary. A thumb wipes dust from a dashboard. A lens is adjusted as if for family footage, not surveillance. The engine tone stays calm. The night doesn't. By morning, official voices would measure the event in politics. The cost would be counted in absences. By mid-April 2018, in the Barzeh district north of Damascus, cameras were already cataloging destruction at a scientific studies and research center. Compound images of broken stairwells, peeled concrete, and neat phrases in captions that tried to make violence readable. Masyaf sat farther west, a quieter dot by comparison, but connected by function. Research, production, secrecy, and the national habit of calling laboratories centers, as if the word itself could blur what happened inside. This is where the cover begins, not a single operative's disguise, but a state's architecture of plausible denial. The Scientific Studies and Research Center, known by its French acronym SIRS, or sometimes simply as the SSRC, had been the subject of Western scrutiny for decades. Its work was described in public reporting as spanning strategic weapons domains, with competing claims about how much involved missiles, how much involved chemical agents, and how much was bureaucratic myth designed to frighten enemies and reassure allies. Western governments maintained sanctions against SSRC-linked entities, citing suspected roles connected to weapons programs. The ambiguity was part of its defense. In that world, Rami Abdul Rahman, of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, becomes a different kind of witness, remote, contested, yet repeatedly quoted, stating that Iranian experts were present at the Masyaf site and that missile work was tied to Allied support from Tehran. His statements don't come from declassified files. They come from monitoring networks, from contacts inside the country, and from a war economy of information where every claim is currency. They are reporting under constraint, offered to journalists who must decide how much weight to give them. Visually, the scene stays domestic. Sun on stone, a courtyard hose dripping onto cracked tile, the dull repetition of routine that marks life in any provincial town. A center can be attacked, rebuilt, sanctioned, struck again, yet still keep its real inventory behind other people's uncertainty. The documentary approach holds these contradictions without resolving them. The first legend in this story isn't a fake passport or a borrowed name. It's the idea that a facility can be both everywhere and nowhere at once, present in satellite photographs and intelligence briefings, absent from any honest accounting of what happens inside. Secrecy isn't just silence. It's a daily schedule that keeps moving so no one has to name what they're protecting. If the building can hide, what happens when a person can't? By early August 2018, the name Aziz Asbar had crossed borders in the way certain names do quietly, through security services, sanctions, conversations, and analysts' briefings that never appear on screen. Public accounts described him variously: a senior scientist, a research director, sometimes even general in certain reports, reflecting the blurred line between laboratory work and state power in Syria's system. The titles accumulated like sediment, each one adding weight without adding clarity. What remains consistent in reporting is the geography of his professional life. Masyaf, tied to the SSRC network, and allegations that his work sat close to programs. Enemies considered existential precision missiles that could threaten Israeli cities. And in some accounts, chemical weapons-related leadership knowledge that made him valuable and dangerous in equal measure. Intelligence assessments, as later reported by journalists citing unnamed officials, suggested he held a position that gave him access to some of Syria's most sensitive military research. One defector, Brigadier General Zaher al-Sakat, would later describe Asbar in unexpectedly human terms: respectful, pleasant, intelligent, careful with words. Then add a colder observation: people in that world aren't sociable because they feel watched. The surveillance isn't always electronic, it's cultural. Embedded in the habit of guarding every sentence, that watchfulness becomes behavior, shaping posture, conversation, the rhythm of daily movement. The cover life, if it existed for any attacker, is not documented in public. No named apartment, no hotel district, no disclosed alias. What can be shown is the target's own routine as reported leaving home, moving through familiar roads, living inside the knowledge that his profession made him visible. Every scientist at that level understood the bargain. Expertise brought privilege. But it also painted a target. In parallel, ordinary surfaces persist. A kettle heating on a stovetop, a balcony plant absorbing water in the late afternoon light, a street vendor folding cardboard at the end of his shift. Not because those details are confirmed in any intelligence file, but because the war's most intimate cruelty is how normal it can look from 10 meters away. When a person becomes a program, every small habit becomes a vulnerability someone else can price. In this story, the first surveillance is reputational long before anyone watches the road. In September 2017, reporting said the Mossad Research Center was hit by airstrikes, with fire damage described in connection with stored materials. Syrian state media acknowledged the attack while condemning what it called Israeli aggression. Then, on the 22nd of July 2018, Syrian state media and monitoring groups again reported an Israeli strike on the same site. The public language stayed careful, official spokespeople declining comment, analysts drawing careful lines on maps, journalists writing "suspected," reportedly. According to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, this is the tension the record holds. Airstrikes are loud, attributable by pattern if not by confession. They announce policy. They leave craters that can be photographed from space. But they also leave problems unsolved. A facility can rebuild. Workers return to clear rubble and pour new concrete. A program can disperse into smaller sites, harder to track and harder to hit. People can relocate to apartments that don't appear on targeting lists. The pattern of escalation follows a documented strategic inference that analysts would later describe. When the method shifts from missiles in the sky to an explosive inside a vehicle, the change suggests a belief that infrastructure was no longer the most efficient target. A person was. Buildings can be rebuilt in months. Expertise takes decades to develop. The calculus is brutal but coherent within its own logic. What public sources do not provide: trigger mechanisms, placement technique, team structure. The identity of anyone who might have conducted reconnaissance remains absent from the record. That absence becomes atmosphere. A blank space where a dossier page would be. A silence that shapes understanding as much as any fact. A recurring motif appears for the first time in full: a hand cleaning a lens. At first it reads as professionalism: keep the image clear, maintain the equipment, do the job properly. Later it will feel like compulsion: keep the guilt distant, keep the hands busy, keep moving so you don't have to think about what the clear image will eventually show. Israel has long conducted strikes in Syria, part of a campaign officials have sometimes acknowledged in general terms while declining to confirm specific operations. The region's intelligence war includes both overt military action and covert claims that surface only in afterward reporting, pieced together by journalists from fragments and anonymous sources. Air power ends at the edge of politics. Covert violence begins where accountability stops. The July strike on Mossad left concrete wounds. The next move wouldn't come from the sky. On the 5th of August, 2018, wire service language spread quickly across news desks. A car bombing, a senior scientist, a research center, a contested claim of responsibility. But the target's world, what he was, what he meant, split into two versions depending on who spoke. One version, repeated across Western-aligned reporting, described Asbar as tied to strategic weapons development missiles capable of precision strikes, and in some accounts chemical weapons-associated leadership roles or knowledge that made him a linchpin in programs Israel and its allies considered unacceptable threats. This version cast the killing as counter-proliferation, a surgical removal of capability disguised as a person. Another version, voiced by Zahir al-Sakat and echoed by some analysts, suggested a darker internal logic, that the Syrian regime itself might remove knowledgeable figures who could later testify in international forums, framing the killing as liquidation disguised by convenient external blame. In this reading, the same death serves different masters. Israel gets credit for deterrence. Damascus gets silence about what its own scientists knew. Neither version settles into comfort. Placed side by side, they reveal the instability of truth in wartime, where every death can be narrated to serve multiple agendas simultaneously. Even the laboratory in the title becomes suspect here. Public reporting anchors Asbar not to a university building with signage and student corridors, but to a military research organization's facility, in and around Mossad, a place that functions like a lab but does not behave like academia. One implies public knowledge, peer review, international collaboration. The other implies compartmented fear, need-to-know protocols, and guards at every door. The scene alternates between registers. A quiet Mossad morning, shutters half open, dust settling on a plastic chair left on a balcony, and the colder visuals of documentation, satellite-style distance. The bureaucratic language of center, sector, unit. The record will not give us his office, his bench, his hands in latex gloves adjusting equipment. It gives us only the outer perimeter. The fact that he was important enough to die loudly in a way that would make international news. In intelligence war, a biography is not a life story, it's a targeting argument, assembled from fragments to justify what comes next. If the man can be rewritten after death, imagine how many hands were already editing him while he lived. By Sunday, the 5th of August 2018, a statement circulated from the Abu Amara brigades, posted via Telegram, claiming responsibility for killing Asbar, describing explosive devices planted and detonated with precision. The claim arrived with militant branding, the kind of graphics and language that had become standard in the region's information warfare. Public reporting noted skepticism immediately. The group's reputation for overclaiming, its geography far from regime-controlled areas, the practical difficulty of reaching certain locations behind enemy lines, where security was tight and strangers were noticed. Analysts like Charles Lister were quoted describing the group as quick to claim attacks others doubt they can conduct. Building myth through attribution, whether earned or not. This moment pivots into the psychology of attribution, how covert violence creates meaning through fog. A covert operation is not only the act itself, it's the confusion that follows, the competing claims, the uncertainty that benefits everyone except the dead. When a rebel faction claims an assassination, it gains myth and leverage with supporters. When a state is blamed, it gains deterrence without confession, a reputation for reach that doesn't require admission. When a regime benefits from ambiguity, it gets a free narrative shield, able to point fingers elsewhere. The claim exists as an archival artifact in its own right, a screenshot, a timestamp, a short statement with militant styling. It is not a declassified memo or an intercepted communication, but it behaves like evidence because audiences treat it that way, sharing and analyzing and debating as if the claim itself constitutes proof. What can be verified is that the claim existed and spread through channels that journalists monitor. What cannot be established from public sources is whether the claim was true. The motif returns. Someone cleans a lens again, this time slower, as if the camera itself doubts what it's seeing. Domestic sound design fills the gap where certainty should be. A spoon stirring against glass, a neighbor's radio playing through thin walls, distant traffic on roads that lead everywhere and nowhere. Violence is always louder than it needs to be. Deception is quieter than it should be. In war, responsibility is a currency that everyone wants to spend. The dead rarely get to decide who claims them. The world had a suspect. The case was still empty. Public reporting, especially accounts attributed to an unnamed Middle Eastern intelligence official speaking to journalists, would later claim that Israel had been tracking Asbar for a long time, even before the Syrian conflict reached its current intensity. The surveillance allegedly stretched back years, through changes in government and shifts in regional alliances, a patient accumulation of information about routines and vulnerabilities. Other reports described Asbar as deeply networked access to senior Syrian leadership through his technical expertise, connections to allied Iranian and Hezbollah figures through joint programs, and work tied to precision-guided missile development that allegedly included references to Sector 4 and modifications to rockets described as capable of reaching Israeli cities with accuracy that previous generations of weapons could not achieve. These claims arrive as assertions from sources with unknown incentives, carried by reputable outlets with careful attribution, but not independently documented through disclosed files or official confirmation. The language stays disciplined, reported, according to officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, described by sources familiar with the matter. The line between confirmed event he died in a car bombing on a specific date and asserted rationale why he was targeted, and by whom remains clean but also frustratingly thin. In the reconstructed rhythm of intelligence work, this chapter is mostly waiting. If tracking occurred as described, it involved long stretches of nothing. Repeated routes observed without incident. Repeated doors watched without revelation. Repeated hours when no decision is made because the moment isn't right. Sunlight slides across a wall, marking time that moves slowly when you're watching and quickly when you're not. But the psychological thread tightens anyway. Even an unnamed operative or an unnamed local asset gathering information, or an unnamed planner reviewing files in an office far away must live inside normality while holding violence in reserve. No invented apartment exists in this narrative. Only the universal truth of covert work that memoirs and interviews have documented across decades. The body must keep doing ordinary things, eating meals that taste like nothing, sleeping in shifts, cleaning the same equipment repeatedly while the mind rehearses an irreversible act. The longest part of an assassination is not the explosion that ends it. It's the calendar that precedes it, the accumulation of days that feel identical until suddenly one of them isn't. When the night finally came, the public would see only seconds, never the years. On Saturday night, the 4th of August 2018, reports say Aziz Asbar was killed when an explosive device targeted his car near Mossad, described variously in different accounts as in the town itself, just outside it, or more vaguely in Hama countryside. The geography remains deliberately imprecise, as if the location itself were classified. Multiple accounts agree on the immediate human fact. Asbar died, and his driver, in some reports described as a bodyguard or member of a protective detail, also died. 2 lives ended in the same moment, though only one would be discussed in the headlines that followed. Everything else in the public record becomes careful language, hedged and qualified. Reports don't provide a car model that can be verified. They don't publish a street name that can be found on maps. They don't release forensic diagrams or crime scene photographs. This is not a gap to fill with imagination. It's the true texture of clandestine violence. It happens in details the public will never be allowed to hold, in specifics that disappear into classification, or simply into the chaos of a war zone, where records aren't kept. So the scene stays restrained. The camera remains outside the vehicle, observing without entering. Sound design does the work that visuals cannot. Engine hum steady on a quiet road, gravel texture under tires, the small click of a turn signal that meant nothing and everything. In reconstruction, the most domestic gesture is the simplest. Someone checks a mirror, adjusts position in a seat, reaches to change the air conditioning. These aren't presented as fact. They're presented as the kind of motions that would have happened, unseen, in any car seconds before impact. Then, the cut hard back to documentation. headlines scrolling across screens. Official non-comments from spokespeople who had clearly been briefed to say nothing. The repeatable phrases, car bombing, and scientist, that would circulate for days. In the files that may exist somewhere, it becomes neutralized, a word that sounds clinical and final. In the car, it was just a man and whoever sat beside him, and a moment that neither of them saw coming. The explosion ended one story and triggered a dozen competing versions of the next. By Sunday morning, the 5th of August, 2018, pro-government outlets, including Al Watan, were reporting the death with the careful phrasing that characterized Syrian state media, acknowledging the incident while framing it within larger narratives of external aggression. Monitoring groups like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights were being cited by international journalists for additional details and context. International reporting framed Asbar as head or senior figure within the Masyaf Research Center. Though the exact title varied by outlet, the language stayed provisional throughout. Because in this region, certainty can be lethal. Journalists who commit too firmly to one version risk becoming targets themselves, or losing access to sources who value discretion. The first hours operate like an incident log, a record of claims rather than facts. What is said, who says it, and what each source gains from the telling. A rebel-linked claim points one direction, toward opposition capability and revenge. A pro-government paper points another, toward external enemies and violated sovereignty. A monitoring group adds context about prior strikes, allied presence, and ongoing conflict that makes every death part of a larger pattern. A foreign government declines comment, which is itself a kind of statement, in place of declassified cables or intercepted communications. Observers see something more modern and more fragile. Open source fragments, trying to behave like evidence. Social media posts and news reports and official statements assembled into narratives that may or may not reflect what actually happened. In these hours, the hidden operational chain, if one existed, does what it is designed to do. It disappears. If this was an intelligence operation conducted by a foreign service, the planners wanted no arrests, no photographs, no intercepted confession that could be displayed at a press conference. If it was a rebel operation as claimed, the perpetrators still had incentive to vanish into the population. If it was internal liquidation disguised as external attack, the silence would be part of the method. Different actors, same practical outcome. No clear fingerprints, only competing claims. The motif returns again, lens cleaning now done too vigorously, as if clarity could scrub away moral residue. Every faction will use this death for its own purposes. Very few will mourn it honestly. The aftermath of covert violence is a contest to control meaning before facts can solidify. Within 48 hours, an Israeli minister would speak not to confess, but to signal. On Tuesday, the 7th of August 2018, Israel's intelligence minister Yisrael Katz addressed the reports with the ritual phrase that had become standard for such occasions, no comment, and then stepped carefully around it. Paraphrased in multiple outlets with slight variations in translation, his meaning was consistent. If Asbar had been developing chemical weapons and longer-range missiles capable of threatening Israel, Katz said he welcomed his demise. It's a chilling kind of statement because it is both personal and abstract simultaneously. It avoids operational admission while validating the moral framework that would justify the act if Israel had been responsible. It welcomes a death without claiming the killing, celebrates an outcome without acknowledging a method. In the history of intelligence operations and their public aftermath, this is the face of negative space acknowledgement, without accountability, deterrence, without fingerprints. The scene builds like an unclassified briefing. A radio studio somewhere in Israel. A microphone positioned for an interview. A voice that stays calm, because calm is power. The minister speaks, knowing his words will be parsed by analysts in multiple capitals, knowing that what he doesn't say matters as much as what he does. The narration doesn't raise its volume. It doesn't celebrate or condemn. It lets the sentence sit and rot slowly in the viewer's mind. acquiring meaning through repetition. This chapter also introduces the second public thread that would shape understanding of the event. Reporting citing an unnamed Middle Eastern intelligence official saying Israel was behind the assassination and had tracked Asbar for an extended period. These accounts describe a chain of belief rather than a released case file. What the Israelis believed about Asbar's work. What the official confirmed about the operation. What was said to have happened in the planning stages. The boundary remains clear in responsible reporting. This is asserted, not declassified, claimed, not proven. And still, the cost feels real and immediate. A public official can welcome death as policy, speaking into microphones that carry his voice around the world, while the dead remain only a photograph and a crater in a road somewhere in Hama province. Power doesn't always lie. Sometimes it simply speaks in a way that makes truth irrelevant, that sidesteps the question of what happened to focus on what it meant. The next question wasn't who died, it was what died with him. In reporting attributed to intelligence sources speaking to journalists, Asbar was described as leading Sector 4, sometimes called a unit or department, within the broader SSRC structure tied to precision-guided missile work. The accounts included references to Syrian rockets such as the SM-600, also known by the designation Tishreen, and alleged cooperation with Iranian partners who provided technical expertise and funding. One widely circulated account, named Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force, as an alleged collaborator in efforts to expand precision production inside Syria, a claim that situated Asbar's work within the larger regional confrontation between Israel and Iran. Other accounts emphasized that the Masyaf Center had long been on Israel's radar as a facility of concern, and that Western governments had sanctioned SSRC-linked entities for suspected roles connected to chemical weapons programs. This is the strategic argument for a targeted killing, laid out in the language of threat assessment. Remove a node, slow a program, signal deterrence to anyone else who might consider similar work. The logic is clean on paper, persuasive to policymakers who must weigh risks and benefits in abstract terms. Then comes the moral counterweight that any honest assessment must acknowledge. A node is also a human being with a life outside the targeting folder, and programs are rarely housed in one skull. If precision work existed as described, it likely survived Asbar through documents stored in secure facilities, through teams trained in the same techniques, through institutional memory that doesn't explode when a car does. The knowledge disperses. Only the person is finite. Here, the psychological deterioration thread becomes explicit but carefully universal, applicable to anyone involved in sustained covert work. No claim about what any unnamed operative felt, only what sustained deception does to posture that has been documented in memoirs and studies. The way shoulders rise and never fully drop. The way a hand keeps wiping the same glass even after it's clean. The way sleep becomes shallow and dreams become operational. The lens cleaning motif now reads like an attempt at purification that never quite succeeds. The only responsible questions remain, unanswered because they may be unanswerable. Did the act prevent future harm, or did it simply move the conflict into a deeper shadow where it becomes harder to see? Was it justice for past actions? Revenge for perceived threats? Preemption against future capabilities? Or a political message written in a body? This is the chain of decisions chapter. Not explosions, decisions. A target list compiled over months or years. A timing window identified and approved. A choice to accept collateral risk to a driver whose name never appears in public reporting, whose family never receives an explanation. Assassination promises efficiency, but it often delivers only loneliness, outsourced to silence, hidden in classification, felt by families who grieve without acknowledgement. The operation was over. The consequences were just starting to surface. In the days following the 4th through 7th of August 2018, public reporting emphasized the same tension that had defined the event itself. The Masyaf site mattered strategically, and someone had demonstrated they could reach into that matter through a human body. Whether Israel was responsible or not, and responsible reporting continued to hedge on this question, the effect was measurable in behavior that analysts could observe and describe. Security tightens after such events. This is documented pattern, not speculation. Routes change for anyone who might be a similar target. Trusted circles shrink as suspicion spreads about how information leaked, about who might have provided access or intelligence. A research ecosystem becomes more paranoid, because paranoia is rational when deaths arrive without signatures, when colleagues disappear into violence that no one officially acknowledges. But the documentary approach refuses to invent the clampdown specifics. No claim of door-to-door raids or named arrests appears, unless documented in reporting. Instead, the record shows what is verifiably implied. Silence grows where there might have been communication. The facility's public profile does not suddenly become transparent. It becomes more opaque, harder to report on, more resistant to the monitoring that organizations like the Syrian Observatory attempt. The narrative returns to the earlier strikes, September 2017, July 2018, because the arc matters for understanding what came next. First, infrastructure is hit from the air with missiles that announce themselves. Then, a person is killed in a way that leaves no crater visible from satellites, even if those acts were unrelated, conducted by different actors for different reasons. The pattern teaches everyone the same lesson. There are multiple ways to reach you, and some of them do not warn you with sirens or give you time to run. A town hears an explosion and immediately understands it as political, reading violence the way other societies read weather forecasts. In places like Mossad, every death carries administrative meaning. People learn to parse it, to extract information about power and threat, and who is currently winning. The camera lingers on domestic details, laundry lines strung between buildings, morning bread carried in plastic bags, children walking to schools that somehow continue to function because that is how war continues. Not only in battle maps and strategic assessments, but in the insistence of everyday life beside a crater, beside an absence, beside grief that has no official acknowledgement. The aftermath of a covert killing is not closure. It's a new normal built around avoidance, around routes not taken and conversations not had. And somewhere else in Jerusalem, in Damascus, in Tehran, the story would be filed as either success or scandal, depending on who held the folder and what they needed the death to mean. The public record does not identify who placed the device, who conducted surveillance, who approved the operation, who drove away afterward into anonymity. That absence is not accidental or a failure of journalism. It is the point. In clandestine operations, anonymity is both shield and wound, protecting operatives from prosecution, while erasing them from any acknowledgement of what they did. This becomes a psychological portrait built only from what is responsibly general, from patterns documented across decades of intelligence history. If a covert team existed, it likely relied on compartmentation, each person knowing only enough to do their specific task, because that is how systems reduce exposure when operations go wrong. It likely relied on ordinary behavior, the ability to pass unremarked in real streets among real people, because that is how tradecraft has always worked. It likely relied on patience because haste leaves signatures that investigators can follow. But likely is used the way a cautious analyst would, held at arm's length and then released. The real, verifiable human truth is simpler and more disturbing. Someone decided the driver's life was acceptable loss, a cost to be absorbed in pursuit of the primary target. And someone else decided the public would never be told why. Would never learn the name of the person who sat in the passenger seat or the front seat or wherever they were when the device detonated. The narrator's emotional arc shifts here. In these final movements, in the early chapters, the voice is almost obedient to facts, careful not to overreach, deferential to what can be documented. In the operation itself, tension enters through consequence, through the weight of what is about to happen. Now, realization settles like sediment. Clandestine violence doesn't just erase targets. It erases the moral vocabulary of everyone involved. When no one must confess, no one must grieve properly. When everything is deniable, nothing can be mourned. The lens cleaning motif appears one last time as compulsion, a hand moving automatically, wiping glass that doesn't need to be wiped and then stops. The cloth freezes mid-gesture. The camera remains smudged, the image imperfect. Clarity is not always available, not in intelligence work and not in the stories we tell about it afterward. The cost of living under a false identity documented in memoirs by operatives from many services is that eventually the false self is all that's left to go home with. The person who did the job may not be the person who returns from it. If the story can't end in confession, it has to end in an image. Return to the documents that do exist publicly, the fragments that constitute the historical record. The April 2018 photograph caption describing wreckage at an SSRC site after airstrikes. The telegram claim from the Abu Amara brigades that rushed ahead of any proof. The no comment from Israeli officials that wasn't quite no comment. The minister's sentence welcoming a death without naming the mechanism that caused it. Then return to the road near Masyaf. The stretch that sources could only describe in general terms: town, countryside, province. Because some locations are kept vague for the same reason identities are. Vagueness is protection, for the dead and for the living, for those who acted and those who only watched. The competing accounts remain unresolved, held in suspension. The rebel claim that arrived quickly and was received skeptically. The regime accusations pointing toward external enemies. The intelligence-sourced reporting pointing toward Israel as the responsible party. The alternative theories of internal liquidation that some analysts continued to float. Each is part of the historical record. Each has its advocates, but none rises to the level of proven truth. The viewer is left with what the record can bear. The death occurred on a specific date in a general location. The strategic logic was publicly endorsed by an official who welcomed the outcome, and the region's shadow war continued with or without this single operation. The final image mirrors the first. A lens, now untouched on a shelf or in a case. A balcony plant, now dry because no one has watered it. A car-shaped absence on an ordinary road where traffic continues to pass, where life continues despite everything. No triumphant music rises on the soundtrack. Just a quiet, factual line policy as epitaph. Documentation as eulogy. A minister once said he welcomed the demise. The world moved on to other headlines, other crises, other deaths. The seat beside the driver stayed empty. In the archive, success is a sentence, a notation in a file that may or may not ever be declassified. In life, it's a silence that doesn't end, a question that doesn't get answered, a family that doesn't get closure. The file closes because someone chose that it would.